Welcome to the Thought Dakota's YouTube channel. My name is Sean Mixon. I'm the director of Reasonable Faith, and I'm also known as the Thought Decoder. Today, we are joined by Pastor Kerry Decker, none other than Pastor Kerry Decker, to discuss the topic of resolving trauma. Just to give you a recap, in part one of our series that we're delving into, we discussed some of the seeds that create problems that would lead potentially to atheism, such as trauma in one's early life, and how that could go unresolved and impact a person spiritually. Today, we want to take a deeper look into the overall process. What does it look like? How do we actually go into resolving trauma? So, Pastor Decker, thanks for joining me. Thanks for being with me again this evening.
Hey, Sean, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Your
Great.
your camera looks awesome. I'm jealous. We've been discussing that. Your picture is great. Wow, that's what I'm trying to get
There you
into.
go.
But your background is really dark as well, so
Mhm.
maybe I need to get a darker background. But saying all that to say this, last time we talked about trauma, and we said that we talked about how trauma creates some of the seeds, as it were, of skepticism. And we wanted to look into what it means to process trauma and how
Yeah.
do we move forward after we realize that we have it, after we've identified that we need help. Where do we go from there?
Yeah. Well, Sean, that's a great question. And, there's a couple foundational concepts that I'd like to share before we get into the exact specifics of how to resolve trauma. And one of those is that healing essentially means a shift in perspective. And what I mean by that is that typically when something bad or tragic or hurtful happens to us, is that we kind of get thrown into this mode of judging God. Why did you let that happen to me? And that, or or we may even see him primarily as judge, and that the reason why he let that happen to me is because he is punishing me for something wrong that I've done, or somehow I've fallen short. And so you can see how that this trauma gets compounded with our perspective, and that's the key word there, and particularly seeing God as judge. But what if we had a shift, a paradigm shift? And instead of seeing God as judge, we begin to see him as father, loving father, and that I don't have a clear explanation of why God allows all that he allows. I've heard it said before that if we knew what God knows, then we would allow what God allows. And so that
Mm,
so for me, it all starts with perspective. But the second foundational concept is really our practice. And as I mentioned off screen, that trauma cannot be healed in isolation. At least I don't believe that it can be. Of course, God can do anything, but typically that trauma is healed in community, and we have to find our way into some sort of safe relationship. And this was a revolutionary thought for me a while back. Is I I'm a guy. I'm the type of guy who kind of thinks in terms of slogans a lot of times. And one of the slogans I came up with is that God works through people. And when you read the sacred scriptures, is that you see that that's constantly the case, that God
mhm.
works through people. And that one good example is the Ethiopian eunuch, and that he's searching the scriptures, trying to figure out something for himself. And Philip the evangelist comes along, says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the Ethiopian eunuch says, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And so we really need guides in our life. And when you stop and think about it, even when it comes to something as as foundational and revolutionary as our salvation. God worked through a person, that the Lord Jesus Christ, and that in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. We read a little bit later on in that chapter, in John chapter 1 and verse 14, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we beheld his glory, full of grace and truth. And so we need number one, we need a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing God as judge, embrace him as Father. And number two, we need to get connected in healthy relationships, whether that's a small group that's healthy or in a counseling relationship. That's where I would start.
Okay, so let's take a deeper dive into some of these fundamental concepts. Now, the first concept you've said is perspective.
Yeah.
So by perspective, there's always this challenge of perspective when you recall positive thinking, motivational speakers, and word of faith preachers who seem to say that, if you just speak it, then everything will change. Or if you just think it, just say, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. And then you go and you make an attempt to try something that's been difficult, and you realize that you still can't. So what role does perspective have within the process of resolving trauma? What does it actually do?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that I would say that there's a kernel of truth in some of that, because if you don't believe you can, you won't. And so, when somebody just completely gives up and it's the concept of what's called learned helplessness. And when people are beat down, or when people internalize a sense of inadequacy, well, then they just live with that from there on out, But what I'm talking about here is, maybe one way, another slogan that we could use is that I can't, God can, so I think I'll let him. So when it comes to my perspective on God, is that, as long as we see him as a punitive God, that he's just punished me for my sins, and oftentimes sins that I'm not even aware of, and that somehow it doesn't seem like the punishment fits the crime. And so if we see God punish me, stop and think about it. We could ask that question: why did you give me the parents that you gave me? That for some people, they have horrible parents. Or why did you let that person abuse me? Or why did you let my loved one die? Or why did you let my baby die? And on and on and on. And we get stuck in that place of protest. And so when we get stuck in protest, and that's really one of the things that healing has to do, we have to give people permission to be angry, and even be angry with God, and understand that that he already knows, the struggle that we're having. But when we give them permission to be angry, and then the next place we need to kind of walk them through is help them to grieve their losses, and to get sad about those, and really begin to work through that. And so so that's part of this perspective question, is that it's not so much a matter of me just kind of like mustering up enough of the right kind of the right framework of beliefs and just speak that truth into reality, as much as it's a double-sided coin. My perspective is that I can't, and that's true when it comes to healing. I can't heal myself. God can. So my perspective is, I think I'll trust him with my healing. And that makes a big difference.
It's interesting because you point to an analogy. You said, God is, you must think those who start with the belief that God is like a judge, and you must
Yeah.
move from this view of God or this perspective of God as a judge to a perspective of God being a loving father. And
Yeah.
what strikes me about that is that it suggests or illuminates this way we think and this way we reason as human beings when we
Mhm.
don't have the concepts to frame our experience. We look for comparisons through
Yeah.
other things that we've experienced. So
Mhm.
could it be that one way to begin to change that perspective is to challenge those very experiences?
Mhm.
So when I
Yeah.
see God as judge, can I look closer and see some broader benefit or advantage that those negative experiences provided for me that I
Mhm.
would not have had, or
Yeah.
opportunities that I would not have had I not had those experiences?
Sure. Sure. I really believe that that our pain can become that our I guess our what would I say that our hurt can become essentially our greatest point of witness, but not until between here and there. There has to be a process of healing. Is that
Hmm.
we really don't get to the place of really ministering to others um, without that linkage of healing between the two. So yeah, we can reframe. It sounds to me like that's kind of like what you're talking about, is reframing our hurt in a different light, and even seeing God in a different light. But we don't get there as long as you kind of keep on chasing the hamster on the wheel in your
Hmm.
head. You're not going to get there. You have to. God works through people, and that's why we need safe people to be in relationship with, and people who understand the process of how to walk people from here to there.
Hmm.
So
And would you say that the hamster wheel is wanting to know why things happen?
yeah. I'm recently actually at one of our reasonable faith meetings there in Fort Worth. Is that people were entertaining a question about why did this particular tragedy happen, and what would you say as pastor, and I just kind of sat on it because I figured that other people are going to jump in, and I think that the why question is really one that will always lead, typically will always lead to greater frustration and pain. God
Mm,
doesn't explain his reasons to
mm,
me. I wish he would sometimes, but he doesn't. And so I think that a more important question is not the why question, why did this happen to me, but the what question. What do I do next? What do I do now?
mm,
You know,
mhm,
and so
mhm,
and if I just figure out what is the next right step for me to take, is that I will make progress. But as long as I stay stuck in the why question, I'm going to remain stuck in protest. So we really have a choice to make: progress or protest. And
mm.
the only way that we
That's
can
that
get out
preacher
of
coming out of you.
that is it, man. I,
Okay.
I I
Yeah.
know what speaking of the preacher that's coming out of me, I know what I was grappling with a few minutes ago, is that our
Mm,
mess can become our message. There we go.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
one more question about
Sure.
the perspective there before we move on
Yeah.
to. I want to ask you something about the practice as well. So, in the
Sure.
perspective, is
Hmm.
it possible for us to view God as both judge and loving father, or should we not see him as one and only the other? Because it seems as though many nominal Christians, uh, if as it were, often kind of have this caricature of Jesus where
Yeah.
he's just this docile, gentle savior
Hmm.
who wouldn't kill a fly, and then you read the passage about Jesus flipping tables and whipping people out of the temple, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, you can't,
Yeah.
can we see God as complex, both
Yeah.
judge and father?
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus once said in John chapter 14, and I'm going to have to double check that one. It might be 16. And Philip, I think, it's easy for me to get confused on some of these things. Show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus says, have I been with you so long? I don't believe that. I believe the Son is not the Father, but he says, have I been with you so long? He says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And so there's nothing new that can enlarge our understanding of God that we're not going to, that Jesus left out somehow. Now,
Wow.
Rolling back in John chapter 1 again, is that we beheld his glory, glory as the one and only the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. When you have religion that's all truth based, that you end up with religion that it becomes legalistic. But when you have religion that is grace based, all grace based, that you end up with license. You end up with being permitting things that God would not permit. So what we need is that fullness, seeking that fullness, that balance of having grace plus truth. And so, so yes, God is judge, but ultimately that we that God's love is to, and God, the purpose of God's love, if you will, and I think that is probably accurate. The purpose for God's love was to bring us out from underneath his judgment. He does that through the person of Christ, that God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were yet still sinners, Christ died for us. So Jesus is the solution where we can now have that confidence. 1 John 3:1 says that for now we are the children of God. And so, so we can come out from underneath that sense of being condemned sinners to being beloved children. So yeah, in answer to your question is that we need both grace and truth. We need both judgment and judge and father. We need both love and law, because that's a well-orbed or a well-rounded view of the gospel rather than a distorted view of the gospel, at least in my understanding.
So it kind of makes me think about Aristotle, how Aristotle had this notion of a golden mean. For any virtue, that virtue could be distorted. It can be overdone and or underdone. And so what you were shooting for is this golden mean that was right in between. And it makes a lot of sense, because with perspective, it seems like we need to keep in mind that with every analogy, there are similarities as well as dissimilarities between the two things, and that if we see God as completely judge at the neglect of his attributes of love and his presentation as a father, then we miss out on some qualities of God, and that can affect our relationship if we don't fully understand, not that we could fully understand, but have a grasp of the basis of our faith in God and our trust in him. Because, why would you trust someone who's trying to, kill you?
This, by the way, is why I believe family, and particularly fathers, are so important, is because it's in our family of origins that we learn about basic concepts like trust, about security, about value, about responsibility,
Authority.
about consequences, authority. And if we have an absent father or a distorted image of what father looks like, it's going to be hard for a lot of people to kind of cozy up to the idea that God
Wow.
is Father, So
Wow.
I've struggled with that a lot. My dad he wasn't a bad, okay, my dad was a complicated dad, and that there were aspects of his being that left me in a position of that I had to kind of work through. And so, and so I tried to be as good as dad as possible to my kids, but I'm sure I left them, is that I heard it once said that the reason why God gives parents to children is so that they'll have something to work through in therapy.
Oh, hope not. Okay. Yeah. So this idea of practice
Yeah.
and community.
Mhm.
I heard you say connection, which is
Yeah.
it's such a powerful idea because it
Mhm.
does seem as though isolation magnifies trauma or it makes you obsess
Yeah.
over it, and you you cannot check your perspective. That's going back to perspective
Mm.
without
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
This whole idea of when scholars publish articles, they publish in peer reviewed journals.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
it does is that it exposes their work and their thoughts to the critiques of other scholars, and it challenges their argumentation so that those scholars cannot be stuck in their own minds and have these ideals that seem
Mhm.
flawless but are weak when you put them up to scrutiny. And
Yeah.
it seems like community is good for that as well, to check some of these perceptions. Hey, you're going overboard. It's not as bad
Mhm.
as you think it is. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. Is that we're only as sick as our secrets. And
Hmm.
when we keep our secrets out of community, that they have opportunity to fester. I've seen this happen, by the way, in a number of instances, time and time and time again. So I'm already convinced that there was a guy that I ministered to with years ago, and he was a homeless guy, and he was really in kind of in a bad space mentally. And so he eventually connected with our church, and we walked him through the healing process and all. And his life just began to blossom. It truly did. And some of that is that when we got the craziness that's just rattling inside of our own heads,
Hmm.
well, there's no answer to that craziness because all of our thoughts are our thoughts.
Hmm.
We need people external from us to kind of ground us into reality, speak the
Hmm.
truth in love,
Hmm.
that faithful are the wounds of a friend and things of that nature, and to nurture
Absolutely.
nurture and support and on and on. And so I think that with all of its faults, that there is no better solution to our human ills than a healthy church community. You know,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
government can't do it. The state is no substitute. You know, and so I think we really need that place where we can be in community with people.
Absolutely. So before we talk further about
Hmm.
healing,
Yeah,
which results from a change of perspective and practice, is there anything else that you can think of that we need to consider?
yeah, yeah. One of the things that I think that we need to consider is the importance of process. Now, and it's actually one of the first articles that I had published many, many years ago. And I submitted it to a Christian publication, and that the theme of the article essentially is that I think that oftentimes we're teaching for the wrong results. And
Hmm.
so much of Christian teaching, now I believe in doctrine, and I believe in theology, and I believe in orthodoxy and all of
Hmm.
that stuff. I mean, after all, I'm a Christian apologist in addition to being a
Hmm.
pastor, you know. But Jesus says in the Great Commission, he says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to what? obey.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching them to obey. Teaching
You got
people.
me. I couldn't think of it.
No, that's fine. That's fine. You know, half the
Mhm.
time I can't even think of stuff when I'm on the spot. You know, you know. But teaching people to obey is different than teaching people to learn or to know
Mhm.
or to recite.
Mm.
Teaching for obedience requires really a different skill set and a
Mm.
different approach to teaching. And I'm not saying the other stuff isn't important. It is important.
Mhm.
Theology, doctrine, and practice. You read many of Paul's epistles, that's how they're structured. He gives the doctrine and then he gives the practice. But we
Mm.
really don't spend a lot of time figuring out effective ways to help people to truly learn how to obey God. And I believe that one of the biggest obstacles to core belief, core obedience is unresolved trauma, because it can keep us stuck in our trauma. Drives us to inadequate solutions, whether it be socially
Mm.
unacceptable solutions, drugs, alcohol, sex, or socially acceptable solutions, achievement, workaholism, eating, whatever. And so that trauma drives us to apply those solutions. And if we're going to truly grow in our obedience, we have to address the underlying trauma that's keeping us from processing our stuff in healthy ways
Mhm.
rather than self-medicating, you know. And
Mhm.
and
Mm.
I need, it's one of these things that I continually need to grow in my own life. It's not like, I got all this mastered.
Mhm. So, uh, so when we're dealing with people, so we
Yeah,
talked about the perspective, the practice,
yeah,
and we
yeah,
talked about now the
yeah,
process.
yeah,
The
yeah.
three P's. That's something you can
Hmm.
preach. The perspective, the practice, and the process. And so now, when
Exactly.
we think about this process,
Yeah,
uh, let's say I want to kind of pick your brain here. Let's say
sure.
I'm a client. I
Yeah.
come to you for some help. I have
Hmm.
this problem. Where do you start?
Yeah, yeah. Well, a good place, and here again, it's um, I have a little book of devotions that I wrote, and it's not that I'm giving a pitch for it, but I guess I am. But it's on Amazon, and it's called Healing for the Wounded Heart, and
Mm,
100 devotions for survivors of abuse and trauma. And
mm,
and the very first one is that I used the story of the man at the pool of Bethsaida, I believe it is, and 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 he's waiting there, and the story. It's in John 5, and he's waiting there because he is a lame man, and every time that they had the superstition that the waters would be troubled, that the first
mhm,
one in the pool would be the one who would get the healing. And
mhm.
so Jesus came along to him one day and says, and I call this the stupidest question that Jesus ever asked. but there's a lot of wisdom behind this stupid question.
Mm,
And he
mm.
asked the guy, um,
It's a lot of wisdom behind a stupid question.
exactly.
Wow,
He asked
it's
the
powerful.
guy, "Do you want to be well?"
Mm,
And it really starts there. You know, do you want to be well?
mm.
Um, think of all,
Wow.
uh, think of all the changes that would come into this man's life, this paralytic's his life, once he became whole. Because not all of those
Mhm,
changes are happy changes. you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's just kind of like, and I like to do this with the scriptures. Is I like to have what I call a sanctified imagination,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and so if I'm that paralytic, I go back in my thinking, and I'm thinking, okay, what's my day like as the paralytic? And I get up, and I struggle to get fed or whatever, and get clothed. And then I dragged myself out. They didn't have wheelchairs or whatever. And then so I dragged myself outside my house, waiting for some friends to come by to pick me up and carry me down to the pool.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they drop me off at the pool, I hang out there, all day long or whatever. And I'm constantly disappointed because I never get that healing that I'm seeking. But then I play the tape. I fast forward the tape, and let's fast forward the tape to the day after his healing. And so, what's his morning going to be like? Well, he has to get up and put on his own clothes. He has to prep his meals. And then he has to go out now, and he has to figure out how am I going to provide for myself, because beforehand it was just all about, me collecting alms or whatever, and now I have to figure out how I'm going to put food on my table, and I can't go down and just hang out at the pool with my old buddies. I'm going to have a new set of friends. That you stop and think about all of the things that would change, and I think
it's
a big change. And so when it comes to, there is a certain level of I was just talking with a fellow about this today, but there's a certain level of security in staying stuck, because we can blame others for what they did or didn't do for us. We can say, well, you haven't gone through what I've gone through in life. But once, it's the stupidest question that Jesus ever asked is, do you want to be well? And here again is another slogan, is that when the pain of change, when the pain of staying the same becomes lesser than the pain of change, we'll grow. But typically, what we do is that we allow the pain of change to frighten us into stagnation.
So that's interesting, because I wonder if people who have trauma and have solutions to their trauma, such as, let's say, say alcoholism, for example.
Sure.
I think the pain of change means the loss of the solution. To them, it's the loss of the alcohol.
It's fearful.
I don't think they even think that far ahead. Ahead. It's like, when I stop drinking, I'll have to get a job now. And that kind of stuff. And it makes change that much more difficult, to where once they change this, I guess that's why. That seems to explain why people relapse.
Being healthy can be frightening. Being responsible, and we have, in our country today, we have, and I don't get me wound up on that type of stuff. We really have an addiction to irresponsibility, and we really want the state. We want the state to be the solution. And so instead of me finding my own way, we want to be provided for by the state. And so responsibility is tough, because with responsibility comes great rewards or painful failure,
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
also with responsibility, you lose the excuse of blame.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have just to own it. I have to own it that my failure is really because I was ill prepared, or I didn't try hard enough, or I didn't do this or whatever else. So it's scary. Being healthy can be a scary way to live, especially when you're accustomed to being sick.
Okay. Okay. So would you say that the first step then is to have an accounting of what it's going to cost
Yeah.
you to change,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
discuss
Yeah. Do you want it?
first.
I mean, do you want it bad enough to pick up that phone and make the call, or get into that group, or to go to the meeting? Do you want it? And so, as we said before in 12-step meetings that I've been involved in, is that the hardest step is the one, and the hardest step of all is the one where you walk across the parking lot and you go into the meeting. I mean, and so it's tough, but I mean, here's another way of thinking about it, is that all growth requires change, but not all
Some would say
change.
death.
Yeah, yeah.
The death of
But
something.
not all change is growth. So we need to make sure that
That's good. That's a preacher moment.
Yeah.
I can tell you do this often. Huh?
So we need to make sure that we're pursuing the changes in our life and in our habits that's going to produce growth.
All growth is change, but not all change is growth.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that differentiates between progress and busyness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what's next? We've discussed. Do I really want it? I'm saying I realize how much it's going to cost.
Yeah.
I'm saying yes. Okay. Yes. I want this. Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, the first place I take people after that is I get them comfortable with their own powerlessness. And Jesus himself said in Matthew 5:3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so until we get to the place where we understand we can't do for ourselves, we're poor in spirit, is that number one, we're never going to be saved. Because if you stop and think, I actually preached about this just yesterday, not the whole thing, but, part of my message is that people think of how many people say this, is that, well, as long as my good outweighs my bad, I'll probably be okay when I die. And really what they haven't done yet is that they haven't really embraced the notion of powerlessness. How stupid it would be anyway to think that, I could go into court and here would be my defense. Listen, Your Honor, think of all the people I haven't murdered.
Wow. Now that would be pretty bad. They probably put you away just for making a statement.
Yeah. Think of all the women I haven't raped. Is that think of all the stoplights that I've stopped at. Your good cannot outweigh your bad, because when you have to offend in one point of the law is to break the law, you become a lawbreaker. And so the first thing I have to, I want to do in a gentle way is disabuse people of their sense of power, you know.
Mm.
And that's true. And we talked about this, I think, last time. I know we talked about it at the table there in our meeting in Fort Worth. But it's not only true with salvation, but sanctification, or another word would be transformation. Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, verse number 3, he says, "Oh, you foolish Galatians, having begun with the Spirit, are you now trying to achieve your goal through human effort?" And
Wow.
the biggest trap that people fall into, and that's where, a lot of people think, well, the drunk, the alcoholic, all they need is more willpower. And the biggest problem, the biggest trap you can fall into is willpower. The reason why,
that's what's broken.
Yeah, well, it's really not our willpower that's broken; is that we are broken. Let me explain what I'm thinking here. Is that if I succeed through willpower, then I get the credit. So willpower leads to pride, or if I fail because I didn't have enough willpower, then I get the blame. So willpower always will take us to either pride or shame. That's the place that it will take us to.
Wow, that is heavy stuff.
Yeah, there has to be a third way. That is not the way of willpower. And it's the way of that I can't, God can. So I think I'll let him work in my life through the power of his Spirit, and that's the only way you get healed.
Pastor Decker, I have to pause you very quickly. Is there anyone you want to reference for that? This concept you just laid out?
All right.
Is this something original to you, or did?
No. I mean, everything that I have. Okay, I've had a few original thoughts, but everything that I've had, I've stolen from somebody else.
Yeah. You just forget where you got it from. That's like that's what us teachers do. We steal everything. I use that in my classroom. That's interesting. So willpower goes two ways. Either goes down the way of shame or the way of pride.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a nugget. That is something to chew on.
Yeah. That's why we need the Spirit. And that's why we need God's Spirit within us. That because we are dead in sin, and dead people don't have willpower. Is that we need transformation.
That's right. Dead people don't have willpower.
We need transformation power. And the only thing that's going to transform us is God's Spirit within us.
Wow, that's leading by the Spirit.
Yeah.
This humility to follow behind the Spirit, to submit to the Spirit. It just, put in this context, it makes that idea even much more richer.
Yeah. It just dawned on me while you were talking about that, is that living in the Spirit is what spirituality is about. Willpower is actually sowing to the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
You're not sowing to God's Spirit. You're sowing to what you can do for yourself.
That's really good, because if we look at Romans 7 and 8, when it's in 7, he says that I would do, I do not, except the thing I hate. That's what I do. It's this idea of will. There's your will. I see God's law. I see God's holy standard. And his moral law, and I want to will myself towards it. But I keep doing the thing that I'm trying to get myself away from. And so he was trying to figure out, he says, well, no good thing dwells in me, for all that dwells in me is sin. And then it's the 8th chapter that he talks about being led by the Spirit. So we have this dichotomy between willing
Yeah.
ourselves towards obedience and being led by
Yeah.
the Spirit
Yeah.
towards a life of fruitfulness.
Yeah.
So I think you have some scriptural support for that
Sure.
idea.
Yeah. No. And just real quick, while you were there's a passage of scripture. I believe it's in Psalm 32. I'd have to double check it, but where David, it's the psalm where he's talking about blessed is the one whose sin is covered and whose transgressions are forgiven, and and so on. But later on in that chapter, he says this. He says, "Do not be like the horse or mule that has to be curbed by bit and bridle, or else they will not come to you." And the way that you get a horse or a mule to conform to your will is through pain. You put that, you pull, and that pain causes them to turn. And David says that motivation of pain, well, I think it serves a good purpose. It will bring us into the process that we have to get to the place where we are willing to do God's will. And
Nicole, thanks for watching, Nicole. She says, "That's good." Yeah, so that's some interesting idea to think about this willpower. So you go over the cost. So there's an accounting when they first come. This is, have you considered what it's going to take for there to be change in your life? Are you ready for this change? Are you willing to make that sacrifice?
Yeah.
Do you want to get well?
Yeah.
Because there's a sacrifice that you must make. There's going to be growth. There's going to be change. And then the next step is you have to realize that what you've done so far does not work. You cannot depend on yourself.
Yeah.
Right. What you're doing is not working. In so many words.
And once I really liked this guy. He was a heroin addict that I was ministering to, but I really liked him. And that, and he said once in one of our group meetings, he said, my best thinking got me here. All of his solutions led him into heroin. That was his best thinking that got him where he was at. And so we have to rely on something outside of ourselves, and that's the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God, however, oftentimes gets the Spirit works in us, but the Spirit ministers to us in community. It has to happen in community.
Whoa! Oh, that's heavy there. You just threw a grenade into the pit. Wow.
Yeah.
It works in us, but it ministers to us through community. Oh my God, that is brilliant.
Yeah, you think about your life. How have you grown in your life? Is that you didn't think your way into all of the thoughts that you have inside of your head. You have a lot of books behind you. I suspect that you've read some of those. And really what a book is that you are engaged in community.
That's right.
You're communing with a mind
That's right.
In some cases is dead, And so
that is so true.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful thought.
Yeah.
That the Spirit, so and it makes me think of this verse in Paul. I don't know I think that's Paul, or maybe in Hebrews, but it's the verse that says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves.
Together.
Hebrews. And much more when you see the evil days drawing near. And this idea of then Paul picks up on it. It seems like he talks about the gifts, how the gifts are for the body in the Corinthians. We have different gifts, but we're one body, and those gifts are for the edification of the entire body. And so this idea, it's biblical. but what you've
Yeah.
said, you've seemed to capture it
Mhm.
succinctly into
Yeah.
in a concise way. That's
Yeah.
I think that's what you get from speaking publicly, because you have to say a lot
Well,
in a short amount of time, and then
and
you get used to
it took me a lot of brain damage to get here. I mean, seriously. It's, it's-
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
didn't just shake the tree
Mm,
and this fruit fell off. Is
mm,
that there
mm,
is a lot of kind of growth and maturity, and I've listened to constant, thousands of hours of other people teaching, and I've read
mm,
hundreds and hundreds of books, and I continue every day. I stay engaged in some
mhm,
sort of learning process.
mhm,
So
mhm. This idea of community.
yeah,
So isolation, it's odd that we have this desire to isolate when we're hurt,
yeah, yeah,
that we
yeah.
want to get away from community.
I was just talking with a fellow who has mental illness, and he told me um, he told me something that, and he has a schizoaffective disorder. And he says
Mm,
that what it does is that it isolates. Mental illness
mm,
isolates people. And, because, the vast majority of people are afraid to be around the mentally ill. And,
mm.
and so they just get trapped inside their own crazy thinking, you know,
Wow,
you know, so
wow. That's interesting. Let me ask you, let's switch gears a little
yeah.
bit. When we talk about this absolute failure to deal
Mhm.
with one's own life,
Yeah,
uh, that has to bring grief,
sure.
because
Sure.
this idea of failure is and not being successful in your own life is grief, is
Mhm.
grieving. So, how would you define grief?
Well, I believe that grief is the emotional process of accepting reality. And let me unpack that for a minute. Is that now the reality has two sides to it. And this is where people, and this, by the way, is where people end up. People end up in one of two places. Well, actually, one of three places. They end up in either hope, true hope, or they end up with false hope, or they end up in despair. And false hope and despair really are, I mean, two sides of
Mm.
the same coin.
Mhm.
But reality, if you
Mhm.
stop and think about it, here's a simple definition of reality. Life hurts. If we just stop there, we end up in despair.
Mm.
But life hurts, but God heals. And so grief is the emotional process of accepting reality. Some people live denying their hurt. Other people live denying the prospect of hope. You
Wow.
know
Woo.
that that
This is
you
good.
know that what I've gone through, you know, and like I say, I've had the front row seat in watching human suffering or
Wow.
observing human suffering.
Oh my
These kids who have
goodness.
been trafficked, and like I said, some of them are raped over 20 times a day,
Wow.
and I finally had to ask myself, is the gospel good news to these kids?
Mm.
And because they know that life hurts, but what they need to discover is that God heals. And there's, by the way, I think that the process for these kids is the exact same process that we all have to go through. We discover our powerlessness. We want to get well. We're willing to pay the price for that, whatever that takes. And then, as we're talking about now, is that we move into the grief process. Um, Matthew 5:4, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn." He doesn't say, "Blessed are those who stuff it," or "Blessed are those who deny," or "Blessed are those who get angry," or "Blessed are those who get drunk." He says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And so
Wow.
we need to lean into our grief, and learn how to mourn. And mourning is a skill. It's a learned skill, but mourning is a skill.
Okay. So how do we mourn? And
Okay.
what does that look like? How do we grieve?
Okay. Yeah.
How do we get it out?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question, because it's where a lot of people get stuck. I've been working with a lady here recently who has had a couple failed marriages in her past, and in both cases, her husband cheated on her. And so so what I normally do is I just say, okay, that tell me all the ways that this person has hurt you. And normally, and she went through a whole litany, but I'm just going to share the general one of that. I thought, well, my husband hurt me by cheating on me. I'll say, okay, cool. I mean, that's not cool, but okay. So so we get the list. I get the list of all the hurts. And then I say, do you realize that that those hurts are not the loss that you experienced in the relationship? And until we name our losses, because you cannot mourn. I believe this.
Oh my goodness. Oh my God.
You cannot mourn an unnamed loss.
Wow.
So let's just tease it out for a moment here, because it's not that hard to figure out. What are some of the things that she lost as a result of being cheated on?
Her marriage.
Okay, she lost her marriage. Let's keep pushing into it. What are some other things she lost? I'll give you one. She lost the feeling of being treasured and valued. She lost her trust.
That's what I was thinking. Trust.
Yeah, she essentially had an
confidence
in her. Yeah. Okay. And she even lost her own self-confidence. That why wasn't I enough, type of thing. And and so what I have done with her, and what I do with anybody I work with, is I say, okay, let's go through and list all of your hurts. And normally it doesn't take that long to get all the hurts down. I mean, I have a little worksheet I use that I have a person go through and check the boxes that apply to you, type of thing. And I say, okay. And so then when we begin to kind of isolate the major hurts in that person's life, and then I have another worksheet that I actually have them go, activity sheet or whatever, that I have them go through. And I say, okay, let's list the hurt. Now let's name all of the corresponding losses.
So how do we distinguish between a loss and a hurt?
All righty. Well, okay. The two are related, but the two are not identical. So the hurt produces the loss. And so the hurt is the cause and the loss is the effect. And so and the loss typically relates to all right, I'm going to have to tease it. I'm going to have to think that out a little bit further, but the cause and effect. So the hurt was his affair. The loss is her trust, her feeling valued, her feeling loved, her security, her friendship with him, her self-esteem. So the best way that I can say the two are correlated. There's a causation connection too.
Okay.
Hurt
Could
hurt
it be that
produces
hurt is
loss.
could it be that hurt is more related to emotions while loss is the objective, the thing that you can actually measure that was the
Yeah, I think
more
I'd flip it
tangible?
actually. I think I would flip it. Is that so there is a tangible event that occurred when her husband cheated on her. And so that was the objective event.
Right.
The subjective impact, and maybe that's the word that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
best to use.
Mhm.
Loss is related to impact. That's why, by
Mm.
the way, when oftentimes when there's a criminal case, that the 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 offender is tried for the offense, but then the victims, the survivors or whoever, oftentimes have an opportunity to share a victim impact statement, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
And so the offense may be murder, but the loss is so much it's related to the murder, but it's different from, it's an
Mm.
impact.
So
It's a
loss is objective. It has both objective and subjective components,
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah,
a person does, because a person is their mind, but they are also their body, and they're not each one exclusively, but they are
yeah.
both combinatorially. That makes up the person. If my mind leads my body, then it's still me, but
Mhm.
my body is a part of me in the
Yeah,
same way that loss has both this tangible and an intangible aspect.
yeah.
Pastor Decker, I kind of feel like we have to end it right when the going gets good, and when the chili is done, we have to put it back in the refrigerator to cool it
There
off
you
some
go.
more. But it's been a plum pleasing pleasure, and I know that anyone who watches this interview, this discussion, will be blessed, will be benefited, because this is very, very helpful information. And Pastor Deck, you know what that means? This means we have to come back and do another
Let's do it.
another one.
Man, I got
Uh,
so much stuff I'd like to share with you, and I figure
yeah,
I'll go as long as you want me to.
yeah. It's good. It's great. It's great. And so we'll definitely want to come back and revisit. So just to give a summary, we talked
Mhm,
about the approach of changing your perspective,
mhm,
connecting and creating a practice of connection through community. We talked about one has to be willing to change. They have to know what it is that they have to sacrifice to change. They have to give up their own self confidence and their own ability to solve their problems and to fix their situation, and thereby put their faith in a higher power in Christ, Jesus,
mhm.
and through the strength of the community. There's a powerful idea that the spirit indwells us, but the spirit heals us through the body of Christ, through community.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Finally, we need to grieve, and that there's a process to grieving. So we can
Mhm.
talk about the perspective, the practice, and the process, and
Yeah,
and that process is distinguishing between what has hurt you and what you have lost. And we went into some of the distinctions between loss and hurt, that it has both a tangible and an intangible aspect to it. So that's a quick summary of what we covered this evening. And we want to say thanks again to Pastor Kerry Decker. We have enjoyed having you on this evening. And for you, we thank you for tuning in. Uh, like, share, subscribe wherever you see this video at. My name is Sean Mixon. I'm the director of Reasonable Faith. We've been joined by Pastor Kerry Decker. And I am also AKA the Thought Decoder YouTube channel, Thought Decoder Facebook page, the Reasonable Fate Dallas Facebook page. So we have a bunch of different platforms flying out the wazoo, like rockets. So we thank you for your time. This has been another Monday night. Thank you. We'll see you next Monday night. And as always, remember to think better.